Bosworth Davies, a former fraud squad detective with Scotland Yard. Rowan, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's great to be back, Max.
First, quick question. Okay, you were a fraud squad detective, covered white-collar crime in the city. Has the overall level of fraud in the past few years stayed about the same, or has it gone up?
It's good. It's gone up. It's increased.
Right, and it seems to me that, in fact, things have kind of flip-flopped in that instead of really going after fraud, there seems to be a tacit approval by the government by saying effectively that fraud is the business model, that without fraud, the city would collapse. Without the fraud, our GDP would even be worse than it is. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, obviously they're not going to put it like that. And that's why they, I think tacitly, they realize it and recognize it because there is just so much criminal money coming into London at the moment that the government really doesn't want to do anything to stop that coming in because they want to keep that free flow of money coming in. But of course, it carries a great deal of baggage with it. And so what tends to happen, like, for example, in the PPI frauds, what they do, instead of telling the rest of the world...
Explain PPI for a second.
Okay, PPI, this is the selling to customers, particularly in large banks, of personal insurance policies that are designed to so-called protect them in the event that they become unable to work, in order to protect the payments on a loan that they may have taken from a bank. So it's designed, the idea is that it's designed to protect the customer and thereby protect the bank. The problem was the policies they were selling didn't protect the customers at all. They never told the customers this. They made a huge amount of money out of it. And it was institutionalized fraud by any description. But once the scandal broke, and the government realised what an enormous level of fraud had been committed, they suddenly realised they couldn't admit to the rest of the world, actually, we've been committing this billions and billions of pounds worth of fraud upon our customers. So instead of doing that, they gave it another name. They called it mis-selling.
Right.
And because they called it mis-selling, that sounds okay, because that sounds like, oh dear, the guy just made a mistake. He's not to be blamed, and okay, it's a sad thing, and we'll recompense the customer. And everybody thinks that's all right. Actually, the problem is, what the ordinary man and woman in the street doesn't realise is that by calling it mis-selling, they are completely dumbing down the whole context. If you told the man and woman in the street that every single high street bank is out there defrauding you every time you go in and they try and sell you this rubbish, it would send them a completely different message. So it's a way of covering up the level of fraud that's actually taking place by renaming it. It's very clever, it's deliberate, it's a policy.
It's also a bit of a fraud Ponzi scheme. And what I mean by that is that the retail fraud with the mis-selling scandal feeds a certain cash flow to a bank, and then the bank, of course, is engaged with selling, let's say, credit default swaps to larger size corporations and companies for protection against interest rate moves. We've found out now that's completely riddled with fraud.
Absolutely.
And then you have that level of fraud which is feeding into the relationship between the banks and the Bank of England. And they're engaged in quantitative easing, which is yet another layer of fraud, you could say, because they are simply printing money out of thin air that's completely uncollateralized, and they're hoping that this money somehow stimulates growth, but in fact it's just stimulating more fraud. But let me go to some tidbits in the news here. Tracy McDermott, head of the enforcement of the FSA, says it's easier to take on the little guy than go after the big bank. So she's saying, the Financial Securities Authority, that, well, we would go after the big fraudsters, but that's too much work. So we try to go after the little guys, I guess just for show and because they're lazy. Your thoughts?
Well, obviously the FSA have got, they've, like everybody else, they're measured. They're measured by objectives. They're measured by results. So they've got to try and show that they're doing something. And it just becomes easier to go after the small institutions where the chain of evidence is much shorter than it does to go up against the big institutions. But the problem with all this is, and I'm not blaming Miss McDermott. I mean, the fact is that she and her team just aren't sufficiently qualified to be able to understand how you go up against a major mainstream organisation that is behaving like organised criminals. They're behaving like organised criminals in this thing. You have to bring in men and women who actually know how to deal with dangerous organised criminals. And Tracy, Miss McDermott and her team, they don't have those skills.
Right. Well, a couple of points. First of all, the fact that she's really not qualified to do this job over at the SA is not by accident. We find, whether it's in the UK or the US, the regulatory bodies are purposely downsized, or the funding is pulled from them because the banks who are really overseeing these regulatory agencies don't want robust regulators looking at them. So it's not an accident. Number two, you know, she's basically a civil servant who, at the end of the day, is not really interested in an unbiased look at what's going on. But you mentioned something about a criminal organization. At what point does the fraud office simply say, you know, this is, in fact, a racket and has to be approached under what in the U.S. they'd call anti-racketeering laws or RICO laws? It is, your experience as the Serious Fraud Office, this is, in fact, a racket, correct? Because you've got now I see the 4 big accounting agencies are giving testimony today. We know that they're implicated in the racket. We know that when I've worked with them myself, the same names that are being giving testimony today. They came to me with a way to cook books in 5 or 6 different ways when I was running a company in California. That's what they do. They're fraud. The KPMG, Ernst & Young, and the other 2 majors, they're part of the racket. They peddle fraud. But they say, here's their defense, that technically they're not breaking the law. Now, there's a bit of a history there, right? Talk about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, they would say that, wouldn't they? And as Mandy Rice Davies said, the point is that when you move into a level of institutionalized business, such as exists in the upper echelons of the City of London, all the big institutions, the banks, the law firms, the big accounting firms, the recruitment consultants, they're all in this together. You know, David Cameron got it right. We're all in this together. And they sure are. And so consequently, everybody has an incentive to keep the ball rolling. Nobody has an incentive to blow the whistle on any wrongdoing. And consequently, because they have an immense conflict of interests. Wherever you turn in these things, they're conflicted. But it's much easier for them just to ignore the fact they're conflicted and just get on making the money because, and this is for me, this is the bottom line. This goes back to your point about nobody's taking them on. The fact of the matter is, the government has, as you said, they have dumbed down the regulatory agencies. They've taken away from the police the investigative areas they used to have. They've dumbed down the powers of investigators to be able to go up. On paper, they've got fantastic rules and regulations, but nobody's enforcing them.
Okay, so even the all-powerful Department of Justice for the U.S. Claimed that it was unable to prosecute HSBC for money laundering for drug cartels and terrorists because to do so would have jeopardized the financial system. So now you've got a class of untouchables. They say, we know you know that we're criminals and we fund terrorism, but if you try to go after us, we're going to crash the system, as they've done a couple of times. So you've got this 2-tier society of untouchables at HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, Royal Bank of Scotland, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
Doesn't this essentially, aren't they kind of thumbing their nose at the public and saying, we dare you to overthrow us? You know, they're just tempting. They're just saying, we know we're committing crime. We know the economy is shrinking because of our fraud, but we don't think you have the bollocks to overthrow us. Ha ha! They're tempting fate.
Yeah.
It seems.
I mean, they're pushing the margin. Every new product they bring out, every new component they offer to the market, they are pushing the margin of the envelope every time. And you're absolutely right. They know how they're behaving, and it goes right up to the very top of the tree. They know exactly what they're doing. The problem for us is because we have allowed. We've allowed these institutions to push back and push back and push back in the scandalous belief that somehow someday they're going to see the light and become good boys. The truth of the matter is, you can bring it down to basic. It's like the playground bully. The playground bully swaggers around the playground, pushing kids over, stealing their lunch, nicking their ball, and nobody does anything about it. Is he going to stop? Of course he's not. The only way you stop these people is to take them at their word and say, fine, enough and no further. And that's why I was particularly disappointed by the DOJ with the HSBC case, because HSBC, in my judgment, made a deliberate business case decision to set up a bank, which, by the way, was a complete subsidiary of a bank here in Canary Wharf, right? 99.99% owned by a bank in Canary Wharf. Don't tell me this was some little titchy Mexican bank. It wasn't. It was HSBC, who set up this bank with the sheer knowledge that it was more valuable to them to launder Mexican drug money than it was to obey the law. And until somebody stands up to them and says, right, that's it, you know, some of you are going to do hard jail time, they're going to carry on doing it. Now, there was a time when the SEC and the DOJ, working together in partnership, were a real force to be reckoned with some years ago. I mean, that's been changed because the American regulators, and it breaks my heart to say this, have been watered down in the same way that we've been watered down.
Okay, so the DOJ has decided this week to go hard after RBS. They're not going after Citibank. They're not going after anybody else. Is it because the docile British taxpayer owns this bank and is unlikely to protect paying the $800 million fine? So here, another situation. The people of Britain are so easy to defraud and to financially terrorize that America has got them paying for the LIBOR scandal $800 million to come out of RBS, which is owned by the public.
Well, I don't think it's. First of all, I don't buy into this idea that it's somehow a big conspiracy on the behalf of the wicked Americans just to pick on the Brits. I don't buy into that at all. The fact of the matter is that our banks are deeply, deeply implicated in this LIBOR manipulation, and the DOJ, as I've read, has got has an intention to seek to prosecute an element of RBS. I think they're doing it because possibly they've got the best evidence against this particular institution. I don't think this is about just picking on RBS because it's a British patsy institution.
But London is the fraud capital of the world. I mean, this is the easiest way to commit fraud.
I agree with that.
So the regulators are totally compliant because the people don't hold the regulators to the feet to the fire. So why not dump $800 million worth of fraud here and let the British taxpayer deal with it? Because they've already proven themselves to be completely compliant and weak in this regard.
Well, that might be a very good policy decision, and I certainly wouldn't want to argue against that. But the fact of the matter is that in all these, this goes back to your original point. If you allow your institutions to become pariahs, and if your country gets a reputation for being a pariah state because you allow all this dirty money to come here and you don't seek to prevent it, there's a moral dimension that eventually comes back and bites you up the backside, which says you have to take the rough with the smooth. There's a downside for all this upside. So if we are getting it in the neck here as a result of it, we've only got ourselves to blame.
Okay, Rowan Bosworth-Davies, we're out of time. Thanks so much.
It's been a joy, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Rowan Bosworth-Davies. If you'd like to contact us, please tweet us at Keiser Report or at facebook.com/Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.